Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it really means to lead in today's world. I'm Ed Schaefer, joined as always by my co-host Andy Siegmund. Here's something I want you to sit with for a second. You are a teacher. You've always been a teacher. The moment you took on any kind of leadership role, a team, a project, a direct report, you stepped into a classroom. The only question is whether you're teaching what you actually intend to teach. Most leaders think about teaching in the formal sense, onboarding, training, maybe a one-on-one where you explain a process, but the real curriculum, the one your team is absorbing every single day, runs on a completely different channel. It runs through your behaviors, your patterns, the email you send at 11 p.m., the phrase you use when something goes wrong, the way you act when the company is under pressure and the stated values suddenly get inconvenient. That's the course your people are actually enrolled in. This is the follow-on to the reading is leading conversation we had in our last episode. If reading is how leaders grow, then teaching is how leaders multiply. And today we're going to pull that apart. The deliberate teaching, the unconscious teaching, the teaching that builds people up, and the teaching that quietly undermines everything you're trying to build. We'll also get into something I think a lot of leaders miss entirely, which is the obligation to learn, because you can't be a credible teacher if you've stopped being a student. So Andy, before we jump into the mechanics of all of this stuff, when you think about the leaders who shaped you most, do you think they were doing it consciously? Did it feel like they were intentionally teaching you something? Or did it feel like it was unintentional or just a side effect of what was going on?
I think that the folks who had the biggest impact on me, I think were deliberately teaching almost all the time, but they would also blend like being explicit about how they're deliberately teaching, like, hey, let me walk you through this, or let me unpack this, or let me explain to you the way I'm thinking about this, right? Those are like very deliberate kind of like teaching stances. um Other times it would just be by example, or just like by being clear and by showing up, right? And I think that there's like, it's important as a leader to balance, like, hey Ed, I'm going to walk you through this and I'm going to deliberately teach you this, versus sometimes it's just the types of questions that you ask and being consistent about the types of questions. And I don't need to tell you I'm trying to teach you something by asking these questions, right? So like my teams, for years now, I've been in various like document oriented cultures, right? The way that you comment on somebody's doc, right, and provide feedback is also teaching, right? The questions that you ask on that, the suggestions that you make, the stance that you approach that with, that's all teaching. um yeah, and I find that like very few, no leader that I've worked with who I thought was excellent was not thinking about this.
Yeah, I think that resonates with my experience as well. Like I would say the vast majority of leaders that I have worked with or worked under or been adjacent to are not doing it deliberately. And a lot of the things that I learn from them are incidental, or unfortunately, in a lot of cases, I think I learn what I would like not to do as a leader or what I would do differently in the future, more so than the best things to do. But mirroring your experience, all of the best leaders I've had, the ones that I think of most fondly, or I feel like I grew the most or had the most opportunities with, I think were a lot more deliberate in their teaching. Some of the things that you mentioned, especially like the question asking, like not just telling me how to do something, but like, hey, what are you thinking? Or how are you approaching this? And can I give you some feedback, as opposed to let me tell you exactly how to do the thing.
or
So
or sometimes it's, let me explain the way I'm thinking about this, because I think maybe you're missing something, right? Or maybe I'm missing something, right? Like it's sometimes can even take that stance as well. And one of the things I'm sure we'll get into it over the course of this conversation too, but I feel like it's worthwhile to call out like pretty explicitly and pretty early. Um, there's a selfishness, as a leader, that you can associate with teaching too, right? Because if I upskill my team, the more I can form my team to think the way I do, or to anticipate my needs or my thoughts, the easier my job is going to be because the less course correction I'm going to have to do, right? So like it's in my best interest to give my staff as much information and as much of like the I have my job and they have their job for reasons, right? Right? It's skills, experience, et cetera, right? My part of my job is to close that gap as quickly and as efficiently as I can because that one makes my job better, two, it's an excellent retention strategy, and three, it makes them better at their job.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that's let's talk. The first thing I wanted to talk about is the like, what does it look like for a lot of leaders in terms of deliberate teaching, or like what's the explicit teaching? And the thing that came to mind for me that I think most leaders think of is um, teaching the vision, the purpose, and the why. I think that's probably one of the most common like deliberate types of teaching that leaders across the board are going to do. But I think one of the problems with that is that you can't teach by osmosis, especially something like a vision, a purpose. I think a lot of leaders assume that because they've stated the vision, the team internalizes it. But saying something once in an all hands meeting is not teaching. That's just making an announcement and hoping that it reaches the people and that it sinks in. So like when we talk about vision and strategy, I think that real teaching of vision and strategy requires a lot of repetition. It requires context, like sharing as much context and information as you can, and then connecting it to the daily work so that the people who are doing the work understand how what they do day in and day out actually connects to the bigger picture and the strategy and the vision. So I guess the way to think about this would be that you need to distill complex goals into actionable lessons, and then make sure that the people understand the why behind the work, not just what it is that they need to deliver. And I think when we talk about it in this way, great leaders, they really are acting almost as mentors, where they're identifying where each person on the team is developmentally, and then they're trying to close that gap. And they're doing it in a really deliberate way, kind of like what you were describing. So you have to pay attention to what's going on and who understands what and who would be able to learn this new thing earlier. Rather, some people are going to be on the leading edge of it. They might be like the early adopters if we use the adoption curve, and they might be much more open to hearing new ideas or learning them and then helping to pass that message across. Whereas, other people, you might need to broadcast the message to, and you might need to do it a bunch of times before it really sinks in. So, I guess that's kind of what my thinking was, is really a lot of that strategy and vision is where there's a lot of deliberate teaching that needs to happen. And so I'm curious, Andy, we've both worked with a lot of leaders who I feel like they think that they're genuinely clear on the strategy in their own heads, but maybe, I know we've seen this where they get frustrated that the team isn't aligned. So I guess I'm curious, do you think that when people are frustrated in that way, is that usually a communication problem or a teaching problem, or, what do you see as the difference between those?
Yeah, and I think it can be both, right? Like from like an overall strategy point of view, one of the perennial challenges with it, right, is like it is very difficult to articulate a strategy that doesn't sound like you've strung together like a bunch of banal platitudes or like some cliche that's been held been said a bajillion times over, right? Anyone who works a corporate job these days has probably heard the "we're going to do more with less," right? We're going to focus, right? There's a reason for that, and like it's not laziness. Like it's very easy to dismiss as laziness, um but it's because like when you're trying to distill what you're doing, there's like five phrases that like actually can be applied to to your corporate strategy that can be said in like one or two sentences, right? So some of it's communication, and like I want to be real upfront, like it's super duper hard to distill that down, right? Which is why it always ends up kind of being a cliche, and there's a reason that cliches exist, and it's because they're for the most part true, or there's some kernel of truth in that. And then from a teaching point of view too, I think it's like it's very important to remember that like if your org is structured well, right, with like the talent distribution and the knowledge to do the various roles, right, it's, we talk about like the corporate hierarchy, right, or like the org structure pyramid and those sorts of things. And like those analogies are used not just because like that's just kind of what it looks like, oh, I work for so and so works for me, and it cascades out and gets wider at the base, but also like the vantage point that you have across that. And that's where I think folks get lost on like the teaching part, right? Is like it's very, and we do this in our corporate communication, you probably even do it in your relationships at home, right? When you have a certain base of knowledge, it is very easy to assume that other people have that base of knowledge, or have that set of experiences, right? And a lot of it's like cultural shorthand, right? Like we use all sorts of cultural shorthand to signal belonging, or that something, right? Like there are all sorts of trappings of various like classes, right? Of like how did you grow up? Like how wealthy was your family when you were growing up, right? And
How many books
you
did you
can
have in your house?
have, yeah, and you can see like all these different things. Like there's all sorts of various shorthand, right? From like the clothes you wear to the type of language you use. Like, do you say you went on vacation? Do you say we summered somewhere, right? And I know I'm going down a bit of a rabbit hole. um it's very easy as a leader to assume that your staff or the people working under you have the same vantage point, or have the same basis of knowledge, that they understand like this is the financial posturing that we have. This is what our gross margin looks like. If we do this, it will like, if we increase our margin by 3%, it will increase, EBITDA by X, which will increase our valuation by Y. And that's why it's a really important thing. It's very easy to assume that people know that, right? Um, as a leader, it's important for you to make sure that your staff, the teams that you're working with, are being given enough information to make the right decisions, or ideally to make the right decisions on your behalf, right? So like one of the things that I'm constantly, like we've talked a lot on this podcast, right? I work in professional services and delivery. One of the things that I'm always teaching my staff, right? Every job I've had, I've been teaching the staff, is like my staff has historically always been very good at delivering for their clients. And they're very customer focused. That's brilliant. And that's what I want them to do and where I want them to be, because the way I make money is by charging customers for their time. But I need to make money at the end of the day. So I'm constantly having to teach my team about the mechanisms of our internal business, right? And, oh yeah, that we need to get XYZ hardware product in order to do this thing. Do we have to, like, I really don't want to pass on that billing to the company. Like, well, okay, if we take this, like, what's the budget that we have allocated for this? How does that impact the broad financials? How's that actually going to impact? Like, you might think $2,000 is not a lot of money on a $500,000 contract, but we're actually doing all of this at XYZ margin. And in order to get $2,000 of profit, I need a certain amount of hours. Like, so what I'm really doing is I'm giving away a week of Ed's time, or whatever the heck it is, right? And that then helps them understand like the full context of what their request is, which for me makes me get fewer BS requests, but also allows them to better articulate the request when it does come in, right? And these are things that I find are really, really critical to teach your team and to figure out where the gaps are, right? And I think every leader, you'll think about like, I hired Ed because he's really good at XYZ. My job is to be really good at ABC. The best way we can collaborate is if I can teach Ed, every interaction I have with Ed, I want to teach him a little bit more about ABC, so that he's then going to pair XYZ and ABC together. It's going to make my life easier, or he's gonna give better direction to the client and better direction to me, from a feedback point of view of what's going on with the client, because he understands that I'm looking to both retain the client and make money at the end of the day, which seems super simple, right? It seems like, so like, well, duh, of course. Not everyone thinks through that, right? And you don't expect them. And why would they if they hadn't been taught to think about that, right? If your job is to do things for clients, you go and you do things for clients, and you don't think about who's paying your bills at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, closing the loop on the, when people get frustrated that the team isn't aligned, um, I think a lot of times it's not that there's a failure of intelligence on either side. It really is, uh, it's that a lot of leadership, I think, thinks that they can deliver a message or deliver a request or a need, and that will be enough. Um, that'll be enough to transfer the information or to, help people understand the vision or the goal or the big picture. And I don't think that delivery is not enough, right? You need to instruct people and give them enough information to be able to do it. So you can't just repeat the message louder. I think that's what happens sometimes. It's, you'll hear the, like, oh, you have to say the message 7 times before people hear it. And I think that is true. You do have to repeat it over and over again, but it's not, it's like, when you see somebody who meets somebody who doesn't speak English and they start talking louder at them, it's like talking louder at them is never going to help them understand you any better. You need to figure out how you can talk to them in a way they can understand, right? So instead of trying to message your vision or your goals louder and louder, I think it's about checking for comprehension. Basically asking the team, like, play back what you heard, or repeat it back to us so we can really understand whether it's landing or not, or where there's a misunderstanding, like where my understanding and then what you heard and are repeating back to me, where there's a gap. And I think connecting the strategy to what they're actually working on in a particular week also helps them connect their day to day to this bigger picture, plus giving them more context and things like that. So, I think leaders, when we talk about vision, goals, values, or what good work looks like, I think the leaders who teach it deliberately, or are deliberate in their approach, they get a lot more alignment. And leaders who assume they can just say it once in an all hands and that it'll land, they're kind of assuming that it'll just happen, but instead they wind up getting a lot of drift. They get outcomes that they're not really looking for. So, so yeah, that's a basic one, right? That's one I think that most leaders are probably dealing with in some way. So that's a good question. Is like, how do you teach vision, mission, purpose, goals to your people, your strategy, those types of things, so that it resonates with them and they can use it in a way that helps you instead of feeling frustrated that they're not understanding. I think that's a lot more on the leaders than it is on the people receiving the message.
Yeah, they're 100%. And I think, like, you can't teach, in my opinion, you can't teach those super high level macro things. You have to teach all of the components that make that up,
Yeah.
right? So, like, you need to be like, you need to be teaching your staff, the folks you work with, as much as you can about how the business actually works, like the actual nuts and bolts of it. Right? Because that's all the stuff that trickles up into the goals, the mission, the vision, right? Because you can talk about, like, oh, we want to be the market leader in XYZ thing. Well, what does that mean? Like, how do you actually define market leader? Are you talking highest NPS scores? Are you talking highest revenue, highest profitability, most obvious label, right? Like how are you actually defining that, right? Because and then within those definitions, right, you're probably going to have to define some terminology within that, right? So, like, you need to be talking about, like, finance terms and what does that actually mean, right? How does this impact our ownership group? And these are the mechanisms that I think are really critical, like, for you as a leader to teach your staff, right? Like, Do they understand, like if you're in a privately held company, or you're at a startup, do they understand like what options actually are, how that impacts, what the difference between a 6x and an 8x valuation means for them personally, right? Because a lot of folks, like, we take for granted, especially if you're interested in these sorts of things or you care deeply about these sorts of things, it's very easy to assume that everyone does. And the reality is that, like, look, if you're listening to the two of us yakety yak, about these sorts of topics, then more likely than not, like, you're pretty ambitious and you're trying to figure out how to get an edge, right? You're trying to figure out how to grow your career and do something meaningful. That's not everyone. Not everyone is a proper career person. There are a lot of folks who are happy to just have a job, right? You have to get through to them. You have to figure out how to speak to them, and teach them and work with them on their level in the context of what they're trying to accomplish, right? Not everyone's trying to set the world on fire. Some people are just, trying to keep their house warm.
Yeah. All right. So I think when we said, leadership is teaching, when we titled the show, I think that first piece that we talked about is kind of the most obvious or the most common. It's probably what a lot of people think about when they think about teaching. And when we say leadership is teaching, I feel like a lot of people are probably thinking about that. So I wanted to get that out of the way first. The rest of the things we're going to talk about, I think, are different angles on teaching, or our lower level, like more under the surface types of teaching.
Mhm.
And one of them, the next one I wanted to talk about, you've already kind of teased a fair amount, which is I think the next level up, or the next aspect of teaching that happens in leadership, is teaching people how to think. And I would say that
Mhm.
this is really where you upgrade from just managing to actually leading, right? Because with what we talked about just before, that's like explicit teaching, and that can get people to understand the goal. But the next level up would be not just understanding the goal, but understanding the thinking process behind getting there, right? So I think a lot of leaders, they default to giving answers. Someone comes to you with a problem, and what do? You give them an answer. You solve it for them because you've already been through it, or you know all the answers. So I mean, you probably don't know all the answers, but you think you do because you've been through it before. You know how it works in your company or whatever. You've had this same problem with this same client before or whatever. It's fast. It can feel really helpful. And I think as an individual, it can feel good because it makes you feel indispensable, right? Like, oh, I'm a bottleneck. Everybody has to come to me because I have all the answers to all the questions. But the problem with that is it doesn't scale at all, right? It only scales to one
Mhm.
person, to you. And you can't be everywhere at once, and you don't have infinite capacity. So you can't answer every question all the time. And I think limiting yourself in that way and putting yourself in that bottleneck position only hurts you as well as hurting all of the people that you're leading. So if you teach someone what to do, you're basically creating dependency on you. But if you teach someone how to think through a problem, you're creating that capability. And so over time, if you depending which of those you choose, you'll produce completely different outcomes. You'll have different organizations. You'll have different people in the organizations and what they're actually capable of doing. So I think the shift here is when somebody comes and says, what should I do here? Or how should I handle this? Instead of answering with a solution, I think that the best thing would be to respond with the questions that you'd ask yourself, right? Like, what's the constraint? What are the second order effects? What does this customer need? What's the background with this customer? How have they reacted in the past? And, if instead of giving them the answer, you say, all right, well, let's talk about this. So here's some of the questions I would ask, how I would think through this. Here's this first question.
Mhm.
What do you think? And have them answer. And then maybe you could give your own input. Maybe you agree with them and you're totally aligned, or maybe there's a delta there, and you could say, oh, I see where you'd get that idea. But, if you remember, this thing happened 6 months ago with this client, and that person was a detractor or whatever. So taking
Mhm.
that approach might not work as well as if we were to do something else. Right. Um, so you basically narrate your own reasoning, and that acts as the instruction for your direct, or for the person that's coming to you, to give them more than just the answer. It's the actual path that you got there. And that, as you said earlier, that's also the most direct path to reducing your own workload as a leader. every team member who can reason through problems independent of you is one less decision that you have to make, and one less stressor that you have, or one less thing that you have to take on, right? And I guess in some ways, since AI is so prolific lately, it kind of makes me think about when they train AI models, right? Like the AI training, it's I mean, you can't always ask it the questions and have it think through, but you basically have it give you some information, and then you give it the feedback on whether the direction that it took things, whether the probabilistic way that it produced the next token is the right direction or not. And it's like reinforcement learning. So over time, it learns better and better how you would answer the question, or how you would think through the problem. And I think that same kind of concept is really what applies at the individual contributor level when you're working with your people. If you can walk them through that and help them practice that art of thinking through the problem and how to think through the questions and develop the answer, you can get to a lot better place. So, I mean, I guess, Andy, have you been in a situation where you watched, like, have you seen anyone switch from I'm going to tell people to actively teaching the thinking process? And what did that look like in practice? Or if you haven't seen that, like, what's been your experience with kind of those two different types of leadership styles?
Yeah. Um, yeah, and I've seen a few folks like switch over, and it's usually like I've done it myself too, right? Like it's usually because there's a sense that like there's a disconnect, or there's like frustration with like where the decision making process is going, right? So then like yeah, I think the recommendation, right, to pivot to like thinking out loud or explain the whole process out loud is really really critical. In that. Yeah, and I think that's just a fantastic way to go about things, right? Because what you're trying to do is like you want to be, and like one of the things I do a lot with my staff is like I will point out questions that they haven't asked yet, right? What about this?
Yeah.
What about this? And like if you work with the same leadership team for a while, you'll realize that like everyone's got kind of a different role or kind of a different point of view. Like um in the org I'm in right now, right? We've got a deal desk process, right? And the CFO frequently weighs in on things, especially if we're trying to push through a deal where we're asking for permission to make some sort of concessions, right? So that might be an extension on a contract end date. It might be a reduction in rates. It could be any myriad of things to like sweeten the deal, right? And inevitably, 9 times out of 10, he will ask us, what are we going to get? If I give them this, what do I get right out of it? And you realize after kind of going through that cycle, like if you have them on a meeting or whatever, that like this is a question you need to be prepared to answer, right? So it then like he hasn't been asking that question very much lately because he has trained all of us to ask that question by being a very squeaky wheel with that. And that's just like a kind of a cute example. But this has a really really huge impact on the team and on their ability to execute by getting them into your head a little bit more. And like realistically, you're never going to get 100% there, right? Ed is Ed and Andy is Andy for a reason. But the more you can close that gap, the the more like we can then focus on our specific domains or our domain of expertise and spend less time hashing out the kind of messy middle.
Yeah. And I was thinking about why this doesn't happen as much as I might like it to. At least it hasn't in my experience, and a lot of people I talk to, I think they don't feel like they get this from their leadership. And I think it's because um, making this change in your behavior requires that you have a lot of patience, and I would say a lot of leaders out there don't always have a lot of patience. You have to be patient in the short term so you can get a bigger payoff down the road. And I think a lot of times we don't want to slow down in the short term for the speed up in the long term. It's not natural for a lot of us. And there is a cost to making this transition. I won't deny that. In the short run, if you're coaching someone through your reasoning or how they should reason through something, it is going to take longer than just giving them the answer outright. So I think if you're under a lot of pressure, it might be natural to default to that solving problems kind of stance and just trying to give answers to people. But it is a compounding effect, right? If you just keep giving answers, you're going to train the team to stop thinking, or to always bring things back to you, or they're going to feel disempowered, like they have to bring it by you to be able to get the right answer or know what to do. And so they'll stop bringing their judgment and they will wait for more instruction. And then probably you're going to be the leader who's complaining that no one's taking initiative.
Mhm.
Whereas if you take that time to slow down up front and coach them through the reasoning and the thought process and all of that, it is going to be a long-term investment. And I think a lot of leaders chronically undervalue how worth it is to make that long-term investment. And it is one of those things you have to be patient about and you have to be deliberate about, because it's not going to be something that you start in January and by the end of the quarter, by the end of April, everything is going to have changed and everyone is doing it. It's a thing that's going to take time and practice and effort before you actually see the value of that come back to you, whether that's reduced questions or more free time to think through other problems or less involvement in stuff. It's going to take a while before you see the payoff. So it's worth the investment. You just have to acknowledge that it's not going to be, it's not the kind of thing that you start doing and then you instantly get all of the payoff for. It may take some time. And especially if you're making that transition from where you've always given the answer and now you're trying to be ask more questions or walk people through more of the thinking process or understand their thinking. um, it may take time for other people to understand and get on board with that in the first place. So you just have to be patient and plan for it and be deliberate, and don't let your natural inclinations take over to just shift you back into the question answerer. So next up, let's talk about, I guess the first thing we talked about was like explicit teaching. And now I wanted to talk about the, uh, I guess the implicit things, the things that you're teaching that you might not even realize that you're teaching someone something, right? So the deliberate teachings like vision, reasoning, and process. Um, but I think that we forget that our teams are learning from us constantly. And that's whether or not you're trying to be in teaching mode or whether or not you think you're teaching them. Every behavior that you have or that you do is a data point, and every pattern that you have is basically sets a policy for them. And people are excellent pattern recognizers, because they need to read. If you're their boss, they need to read you properly so that they know what's going on. So I guess I'll just give a couple of concrete examples, right? If you're the manager or the leader who is up late at night working and you send an email at 11 p.m. at night and you say, no pressure to respond tonight, what is the team actually learning? They might see the message, no pressure to respond tonight, but what they're learning is that you are working at 11 p.m. You stayed up late and you're working, and there's, and they basically are learning you consider that normal, and they might think that that's the baseline expectation, whether you state it or not, or even if you explicitly say, hey, sometimes I work late, I don't expect that of you. um, you might still be teaching them that the implicit behavior is they should work late, right? If you're consistently doing that pattern, you're really teaching them that. Another one that came to mind was, I'm sure we've heard this before, but like, who's the throat to choke, or we need one throat to choke on this. And like, I know people use that pretty casually, and it's shorthand for like who's accountable for this or who's responsible for the outcomes of this. But when if you think about it, what is it actually teaching? It's teaching that blame is the response to failure. Someone needs to be punished. Safety is only conditional. And so no matter what, when you use that phrase, even if you mean it in a more casual kind of way, or you don't have ill intent behind it, you are teaching people that someone is going to be on the chopping block if something goes wrong. And all the psychological safety research that's out there is unambiguous about this. When people don't feel safe, they stop taking risks. They're more likely to hide problems, and they will start managing your perception instead of solving your problems. So, a phrase like that, if you deliver it over and over again, that teaches people something, and you may not even realize that using those terms or phrases is teaching people to behave in a certain way that you don't want. So, I think that you really need to be mindful of these types of things and think about what behaviors you have in a crisis. Um, I think that what a leader does when pressure is highest is what the team learns that the values actually are. Right. As soon as if you say, "Oh, we're a family here," but as soon as things get hard, it's like the blame game and and performance improvement plans for everybody, then I mean, I don't believe in the "we're a family here" statement to begin with, but if you use that
Agreed.
and then you're in a crisis, you're pointing fingers or blaming people, like all that they learn is it doesn't matter if we said that we're psychologically safe here, that we trust people or we listen or whatever the values are. None of those things matter. The only thing that matters is that when the going gets tough, you need to keep your head down and not be the one who gets called out for something. Um, so I don't know. What do you think about that one, Andy? Have you ever seen a leader who's maybe genuinely surprised when they realize that their team learned something from them that they weren't intending to teach them? And can you think of any other messages that you've seen where, the message that they're sending is teaching one thing, even though the words that they're using or the expectations are different?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I feel like most of the folks I've worked with are pretty aware that like when you have a leadership role, your job is to set the tone, right? Your job is to set the standard.
Hmm.
Broadly speaking, um, the things that folks have been surprised that they've taught their team are usually of the like silly and kind of comical nature rather than the serious nature of like, oh, I didn't realize that was cascading or that like that had spread and scaled. But it's like most often benign. But yeah, I think that like that's something we need to always keep in the back of our head, right? Like we do set the tone, right? We do set the expectations for the group overall. Um, and it's like it's up to us to hold up that bar, right? Um, you know, I I think it's kind of interesting, like if you think of like the very and this scales up at bigger companies too, just because the way the comp structures work. But like the more senior the folks are at any given organization, right? The more upside they have with the company if it wins, right? So typically the more senior folks are paid with more equity, more stock RSUs, options, whatever. So it stands to reason that people are going to look up to how you are working, how you operate, how hard you work, right? How visible, how visible that is, how hard you're working, and probably work a little less hard than you do, and that should be the expectation, and that kind of is by design. But I think it's important for you, like as a leader, to also kind of keep that in the back of your mind, right? Of like what I do, the way I show up is what I'm showing everyone else is the bar or the expectation, and like yeah, I know you used the you have responded to emails at 11 o'clock thing. I That resonates, but also like I think as a leader, like if you have an important role within a company, like it's your job to figure out when the best time is for you to do your work, right? And I don't think it's always like, yeah, you can put things on send, delay, and whatnot. But I think like I work odd hours. I respond like I crank out emails at 5 a.m. and do stuff like I'll comment on docs, and that's because that's the quietest part of my day. And and I'm very explicit with my team about like this is the way that my day is organized, and this is why I do this at this time. Like this is not an expectation, right? So it's not like some weird like subterfuge of like I expect. It's like no, my day is just like hectic and busy, and I think clearest when nothing's going on. So if I've got stuff I need, like more likely than not, I'm going to wake up early and I'm going to respond to some emails or I'm going to comment on your doc before the workday actually starts. But then, like, I'm also explaining that it's like, and then I'm going to go off for a run for 90 minutes and I'm going to take my kids to school and I'm not going to check my phone at all for like that, 2 hours or two and a half. Like, I'm not saying like, so like, that's another piece too. Like, if you do keep odd hours, like, try to be explicit with your team about like why or like where your boundaries are within that, which is then also showing them that like it's acceptable to create boundaries. Like, I'm not responding at 5 a.m. because that's the most urgent thing to do at 5 a.m. and I'm trying to firefight or anything. It's like, no, I'm doing that because that is the quietest part of my day, when my thoughts are the clearest and I can pay the most attention to that request that you had. Right. And like, I volunteered into this.
Yeah.
um, so I think it's also like when you're doing things like that, you have to maintain clarity of intent and clarity of expectation. Because like, I'm sure people don't like to hear this, but like, I don't know anyone in a meaningful leadership position who works 9 to 5, 52 weeks out of the year minus whatever their PTO is. Sometimes we do, right? Sometimes you work way more hours and that's okay. And I think most folks figure out what works for them and what continues to move the ball downfield, and that's how they go and that's how they operate. And I think that's like, that's kind of normalized. And I think also like, if you're listening to this and you're aspiring to have a leadership job, like, you also need to understand like, more likely than not, you're going to have many weeks out of the year where you're going to put in more than a 40-hour work week, sometimes a lot more. So like, be aware that you're signing up for that.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about the email thing. I mean, I think a lot of leaders don't audit what they're implicitly messaging. So I'm in a similar
Yeah,
boat to you. Like, I know I said don't send emails at 11, but I don't, I'm not saying that's a blanket rule. It's more what's the implication of it. So
it-
for at least a
precisely.
decade, yeah, for at least a
Be
decade,
thoughtful about it.
yeah, and for at least a decade now, I've had in my signature, it says something, my working hours may not be your working hours. Do not feel obligated to respond outside of your normal work hours. And that's, that's an explicit message that I put on my emails because yeah, sometimes I do reply at 5 in the morning, or sometimes if I'm traveling in the middle of the day, I might not reply until 10 at night when I get home or get to where I'm going, or things like that. So I think that's where it is important to think about what messages you're sending implicitly, like what's your implicit curriculum, and then kind of audit that and ask
Mhm.
yourself that question, like what might my team be learning from the way that I operate that I don't intend for them to be learning, and then you need to put in the guardrails or protections around that. And that might be like my signature message, or the way you've explicitly told your team, like, hey, this is how I break up my day. Um, and I think it is encouraging to know that the implicit teaching, the implicit classroom works in both directions, right? So it might, yeah, the person who's up at midnight sending emails is giving some implicit lessons, but also the leader who admits that they were wrong is teaching that intellectual honesty is safe. A leader who celebrates a team member who brought them bad news early teaches everyone that transparency is valued. A leader who says, I don't know, let's figure this out together, teaches their team that uncertainty is okay to name. So, I think it's something to think about, like if you audit yourself and then try to figure out where you can change your behavior to give better implicit messages. And this made me think about, from a couple of episodes ago, we talked about stoicism and Marcus Aurelius. um, he was writing self-examinations in his private journal, and it was because he understood that who he was in private shaped who he was in public, and who he was when he's by himself has an impact on who he is
Mhm.
when he's a leader. So he held himself to account, not just because anyone was watching. And I don't know that he ever expected anyone, like that millions of people would read his private journals
Private
every
journals, yeah.
year. But he knew that when by practicing that and adjusting his behavior, that implicit teaching that he was doing would be improved, and that people were implicitly learning from him all the time. So by doing that, it kind of helped him embody it more, and created that discipline between intention and his actual behavior, so that he could kind of close that gap and have his behavior match his intention, and then have his message be better, better shared with the people that he was leading.
Yeah, yeah, 100%. And I think with that too, right? He also had a general policy of, be was it strict with yourself and generous with others, right? So also understand that, like, talking about like what are the implicit things that you're teaching. You can hold yourself to a very high standard, but you need to be more generous, more likely than not, with the folks that you're working alongside, and with your staff as well.
Yeah. Well, cool. So we talked about what we teach on purpose. We've talked about how we can teach people to think, and we've talked about what you might be teaching without even realizing it. There was one more thing I really thought was important for all of this, and I think a lot of leaders don't do this, and I think there's a lot of people who, as they get more senior in their roles, whether it's in the corporate world, or just getting older and more experienced and things like that. I think that this is something that a lot of people don't keep front and center or lose over time. And that's the obligation to learn. Um, so I think what happens for a lot of people is that you get experience, you learn more and more things, and at a certain point you fancy yourself as an expert, or like how to do what you're doing. And what happens is that you stop being a student. um, so you get validated a bunch and all of this stuff, and eventually a lot of people, I think, go, I'm done learning. Right? I've learned everything I need to know. I know everything that's out there. And you may not be consciously thinking this. I think a lot of times it's a subconscious feeling of like, I've done my dues, I've done the work, and now I'm there. And as soon as you start thinking that way, I think that's the moment that your capabilities and how you teach starts to kind of rot away. Because really what you are now doing is, you might think that you're teaching and leading people, but you're basically just repeating a fixed snapshot of what you knew at a point in time that you're now riding its coattails until the end of time. And it's not really a living practice that helps you to keep growing. And I think this is where it's a direct callback to the last episode where reading is leading, because if we said reading is how leaders keep growing, then teaching is how they multiply that growth outward. Um, but if those are in one loop and not, but that's one loop. It's not two separate activities, right? You need to grow yourself, and then you need to share that growth with other people to help you grow some more. And then you need to go back to the well and learn some more stuff and grow your knowledge, or clarify your understanding. Or maybe you thought you understood something, and then you find out that a whole company or whole group of people are doing it completely differently. And that can really change your mindset and your approach. So, a leader who's actively teaching needs to teach from a full cup. You need to have fresh material. You need to have live examples, like real world experience, and you need to have humility. And I think anybody who's stopped learning and is still trying to teach, they're basically teaching from memory. And sometimes you hear this from older generation, right? I'll give a kind of cheesy example, but the whole like, oh, if you're having trouble finding a job, just print off your resume and go walk into the store and ask to talk to the manager, and give it over to them, right? Like, that might have worked 40 years ago or 60 years ago or whatever. That might have been a way to successfully accomplish something, but that's not how it is anymore. And somebody who's retired, and has been retired for like 15 or 20 years, and hasn't applied for a job in even longer than that, they don't have an updated mental model. They're not learning what the picture actually looks like. And I think that's the kind of thing that applies to leadership and applies down to the team. And when you stop being a student, I would say you don't just get stale. You are kind of implicitly teaching this idea that like arrival is possible, right? That there's a point
Mhm.
where you're going to get to the goal, and now you don't have to you don't have to keep growing anymore. You get to stop because you've reached the finish line. But there is no finish line, right? Like, the expertise is not a destination that you reach. It's a discipline. It's like regular practice, regular reading, regular learning. updating your mental models or testing them and like reconfirming them or validating that they really are true. And the people who are on your team who are still very hungry and are trying to learn and grow, if they see you as a leader, sort of like in that you're no longer growing, you're sort of stagnating, then they probably are going to start to wonder if the company that they're in is even a place where growth can happen beyond a certain point, or if the organization as a whole is even able to continue growing and evolving and changing. And if the implication is like, hey, all these leaders, they don't think that they need to grow anymore. I think the implication is kind of like the company may not like it might, we might want to sell make more revenue or sell more product, but maybe we don't want to grow in our capabilities or how we approach things or how we solve problems. And going back to the Stoics, since we talked about them recently, Seneca, he wrote, "As long as you live, keep learning how to live." And he meant it that it was an obligation, not just like something we should do because it's nice to do, but that it's an obligation to ourselves and to be alive. And as soon as you view your position or yourself as finished, you basically forfeit the standing to teach anyone else how they should grow. So I don't know, does that resonate for you, Andy? Like, have you seen a difference between leaders who are visibly learning and growing versus the ones who are like coasting on what they already know? And how do you think teams respond differently? And how does it feel different between those types of leaders?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's not just how it feels differently among the different types of leaders. Like, I think it's how does the organization feel broadly, right? In my experience, like the folks who are consistently learning, some of them are outward about it, right? So I just read this book, or like they'll be pretty vocal. A lot of them are pretty quiet about it, right? And it's like peeling up, an onion, right? You just like learn the, oh, new layer, new layer, new layer, new layer. um both approaches are fine. I think it becomes pretty obvious though when like the leadership team you're working with has stopped growing, because like the company usually does too. Like things start to coast, like you start to feel, you can feel it, like things feel like they're stagnating, and usually you as an individual will also start to feel like you're not doing anything, right? And like I think it's really acute right now, just because the rate of change seems to continue to accelerate, right? Across technology and technology stacks, and like not saying that every organization needs to be an early adopter on the adoption curve. Most organizations are going to be on the middle of the curve, but like if the org you're working in is not talking about the things that everyone else is talking about, you might want to do a little bit more exploration, figure out like what else is going on, and put yourself in a place where you can learn more. Right. I would say the biggest difference between folks who are wildly successful and folks who are not, just comes down to skill acquisition. And I think it's incumbent upon everyone as like, architects of their own careers to put themselves in a position where they can push more and more skill acquisition, right? The faster you can acquire skills, the more skill acquisition you can accomplish, the better things are going to be for you. And the more that that is normalized within the organization that you're working in, the more likely it is that you are going to achieve that, right? We tend to, broadly fit the average of the folks that we are working with. You will, we often think like you're going to ascend to the competency of the best person, but the reality is that most folks are going to regress to the mean of the group that you're working with. So take that into consideration, and remember that like it's your job to keep on learning, and you want to put yourself in a position where that's normalized and expected.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's great. And I think, it's if I'm working on a team where the leader is if it's perceived to me like they're not learning in the same way. They're just kind of like standing on the sidelines and telling people what to do. Um, that means they're not in the arena of problem solving with us, right? They're not growing with the team. They're not solving problems or challenges. They're not figuring out new ways to do things. And I think that's a lot of what the feeling starts to become for the team is like, well, hey, I have to learn and I have to figure out new things, but this particular leader isn't keeping up with the times or isn't updating their mental models of how things work anymore. And I think it's it kind of creates that separation where, we talked about servant leadership when we were talking about stoicism, and it's that idea of the leader is down. The leader's not sitting up on the carriage getting pulled by all of the workers. They're down out in front, helping them pull, and helping lead the way of how we should be pulling and everything, right? And I think
Yeah.
this is the kind of thing where when it comes to uh, continuous learning, you can't just claim that you're still learning, right? You need to demonstrate it, I think, in some way, especially in that leadership role. Like there may be some of the quieter folks like you were talking about, but I would even encourage them probably to work out loud more or be more vocal about what it is they're learning and share more. Because if you name a book that you read that changed your mind about something, or admit, oh, I got this thing wrong, I figured out that this wasn't the right approach, and here's how I learned it, and what I took from it, and how I'm going to change things in the future. Or even asking a junior person to teach you something that they know better than you, and then you actually absorb it and ask good questions. Those are all things that encourage people and it gives you more of a right to lead them and to teach them and to help direct them. Um, so when you're learning visibly, I think you can collapse the distance between teacher and student, right? I think a lot of times people come out of school and there's this idea of like the teacher leads the class and they know everything, and I'm just the student and I'm just learning from them. And in a leadership position, we don't really want it to be so separated like that. We want the gap between teacher and student to be smaller and smaller and smaller, so that if you're in that leadership position where you think you're supposed to be the teacher, maybe you need to take more student type positions so you can learn more. And the people who are the biggest students right now, if you can level them up and improve their knowledge and understanding and their capability, they might be able to teach you or teach other people in the organization. And then there's this, really positive compounding effect that occurs. And it means that you're not when you do that, you're not lecturing down at people. You're basically on the level with them, right? You're modeling the exact posture that you want them to hold. Perpetually curious, never finished, always enrolled in learning something new. And I think that's I think that's really what the obligation is for us as leaders. Is it's not that we need to know everything or have the answers to everything. It's that we need to be always learning and always challenging ourselves and always figuring out, is what I thought correct, and reinforcing it, or is what I thought the wrong direction, and I really need to take it a new way or learn something new, with a new approach.
Mm, yeah, totally agree.
So if that was our frame, that's what we've said for this episode, is that you're always in a classroom, you're always teaching someone something. I guess the next question would be, what should you do differently, or what should you add to what you're doing today? And here's some of the tactics that I was thinking about that I think would be helpful for folks. The first one, I mentioned this earlier, but run an implicit curriculum audit. Pick one behavior or pattern that you repeat consistently. Maybe it's how you start up meetings, or how you respond to messages, or your response time, or a phrase you use when things go wrong, and ask yourself, if my team wrote down what this behavior is teaching them, what would they write down? You don't even need to survey anyone for this. You don't need to ask anyone. You just need to reflect honestly and have some self-awareness. It might help to listen back to some old meetings, or things like that, to see if if you haven't been paying attention to the things you're saying. You might need to reflect back on it, and then reflect honestly on it. And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, then that's probably a starting point. That might be the first place that you should look at. The second thing that came to mind for me was shifting one answer to a question. It might be hard to completely shift to asking questions if you're used to giving an answer. So maybe just try small. The next time someone brings you a problem or is asking you to solve something for them, don't solve it. Instead, ask them, what would you try first? Or what are 2 or 3 ways you might approach this? It helps you still be in the room, and you can answer questions for them if it's needed, or if they can't go down the right direction, if the thinking goes sideways or things like that. But you're helping to build their reasoning capacity instead of replacing it, and you're showing that you trust them and you want to hear from them. So if you feel like if you're giving a lot of answers and not asking a lot of questions, maybe your first step is to just try once a week intentionally find an opportunity to ask a question instead of giving an answer where you might be tempted to do that. The third thing I had was teach the why, not just the what. So find one goal, priority, or directive that you've communicated to your team and check in with yourself. Ask yourself, do they actually know why this matters? Not just that I'm telling them that it matters. If you haven't made the logic explicit or the strategic direction explicit or the context explicit, then do it this week. You could do it in a stand-up, a one-on-one, even a Teams message to your whole team. Just help connect the work to the reasoning, teach more about the why you're asking for something or why we're doing something, as opposed to just what needs to get done. And then the last one I had was learn something and do it visibly. So identify one, a simple way I think to approach this that would really give a good signal to everyone is to identify one person on your team who knows something that you don't. It could be a technical skill. It could be something about a customer. It could be something about an existing process. It doesn't really matter what it is, but just find someone who knows something you don't know anything about and learn from them. And learn it from them in a way that both they can see it and the rest of the team can see it as well. Maybe ask them to walk you through it, take some notes, reference it later. You could have someone walk you through something, and then in your next team meeting, maybe you say, "Hey, Andy walked me through this problem. This is something I learned I didn't know about, so I'm going to try to teach it back to you, or explain it back to you." And they're here; they can correct me anything that I get wrong, or anything I didn't quite understand right. And you're going to be in a really great position, right? You're acting in a humble way, acknowledging something that you don't know. You show that you're open to learning it. You show that you'll listen to people and that you can take information from them. And in that case, I would say that is teaching that's going in 2 directions, right? You're learning something new, so they're teaching you, but you're also teaching them and you're teaching your team that there are things that you don't know about that you're willing to learn and you would like to take the time, and that you're comfortable asking people who know better to teach it to you. And that's a behavior I think that we all want to embody in our teams and have our teams take on, because I think it helps grow everyone. And it shows that no one is exempt from needing to learn, right? It helps them understand that even you in that leadership position still has gaps that you need to learn about. So how well do those resonate with you, Andy? Do any of those 4 stand out most, or do you think any are easiest? And is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think it sums it up pretty well. I think, at the end of the day, right? Always be learning, make it visible, understand that everything you're doing is teaching, and that when you're not deliberately teaching, you're also setting the tone, right? You're setting the standard, and don't be expected when people start to exhibit the behaviors that you exhibit.
Awesome. Well, we're going to wrap it up there this week. Every leader is a teacher. The explicit curriculum, vision, strategy, what good looks like requires deliberate, repeated instruction, not a single announcement. The deeper curriculum, how to think, how to reason through hard problems, that's what separates leaders who scale from leaders who become bottlenecks. And the implicit curriculum, what your behaviors, your patterns, your language, and your crisis responses are actually teaching, that's going to be happening whether you've designed it or not. So we should design it instead of just letting it happen. Underneath all 3 of those is the obligation to keep learning. You can't teach from an empty cup. The moment you decide you've arrived, that the growing is behind you, is when your teaching starts transmitting a snapshot instead of a practice, and the people watching you learn that arrival is the goal. The leaders worth following never graduate. They stay enrolled in the course they're teaching. The question is not whether you're in the classroom. You're always in the classroom. The question is whether you've looked honestly at what's on your syllabus. So here are your 2 challenges for this week. First is the tactical one. Audit one recurring behavior, one pattern, one phrase, one habit, and ask what your team is learning from it. Not what you intend to teach, but what the signal they're actually receiving and what they're actually learning from it. If there's a gap, then that's the work that you need to address. Second challenge, and this might be a little bit of a bigger one, ask yourself whether the overall curriculum you're running across your presence, your responses, and your priorities is building people who think better, take more ownership, and grow. Or are you building people who wait for instructions, hide problems, and manage your perception? You're shaping one of those outcomes right now. Which one is it? If you're on the wrong path, it's not too late to shift back to the one that you're looking for. We'd love to hear from you on this one. Have you ever caught yourself teaching something you'd never consciously choose? Or have you worked for a leader whose implicit curriculum was completely at odds with what they said they valued? Email us at leadershipexplored@gmail.com or find us on LinkedIn. We read every post. If this conversation was useful, please follow the show, leave a review, or share it with someone who's leading a team right now. They're in the classroom whether they know it or not. We release new episodes every other Tuesday. Until next time, keep leading with purpose.